Good morning, everyone. Welcome to By the Horns. I'm your host, Ricky Allardyce, and I'm joined as always with my co-host, Brandon van Niekerk. And this morning, we have a very special guest. He is the chief economist of the Efficient Group, chairman at Efficient Private Wealth. He's a household name almost in South Africa. It's none other than Dawie Roodt. Dawie, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for asking me. Very nice talking to you two, and I'm really looking forward to this.
It's our pleasure, man. We're glad to have you. Dawie, so could you just give us a little bit of background for those who don't know about your academic and your career background before we jump into the discussion for today?
Well, one or two things. I grew up in a Lowveld. I literally grew up looking after my when I was small, before going to school, looking after my grandfather's goats. Growing up, literally eating mupani worms and grasshoppers with my friends on the farm. So I think that really gave me a different perspective on life. And then eventually I ended up in Pretoria. I started doing my BCom degree. I wanted to become a CA, and I wanted to become a lawyer and an advocate and all those sort of things. But somehow I ended up with economics. And I guess the reason why is because it was basically the only subject I could pass. The other ones were too difficult for me. So I did economics, and I did an honors degree later on, and then I started working at the South African Reserve Bank, analyzing the fiscal accounts, and later I did a master's degree exactly on that, on fiscal accounts, on tax systems and all that. And then I worked at the South African Reserve Bank for approximately 8,000 years, and then I eventually left. That was an excellent background, because I was analyzing the fiscal accounts and I was involved in budgets, fiscal stuff all the time. But I was working at the central bank as well, where I learned a lot about money, because it is the central bank. I mean, that's the factory of money in South Africa. And then I left and I started working, as we call, in the markets. And I cut my teeth on the capital market, where government bond instruments are primarily traded. So that also worked out quite well for me because of my background in fiscal stuff. I ended up on the capital market, and I traded on the capital market as well. And then from there on, I got fired twice in my private sector career. And every time I ended up with a computer. And after the second time getting fired, I decided, no, we're going to start our own business. And at least I had two computers, because I was fired twice before. And we started the business. We started the business in my house, and that's more than 20 years ago. And I met our CEO currently then, and we put their business and my business together. And we started the Efficient Group. That's more than 20 years ago. And today, the Efficient Group, we have approximately 500 people working for us. We are responsible for approximately 250 billion rand. We've got all sort of many subsidiaries within the group. One of the most recent subsidiaries is Efficient Private Clients, and where we look after the share portfolios locally and internationally of wealthy individuals. And we assist them with tax advice and with certain structures locally and internationally and so on. But I'm also the director of the holding company, Efficient Group. And of course, I'm responsible for economics, economic research and all that. And I help with the allocation of resources within the portfolios of our clients. So there's a very short background of how things got to where it is currently. And of course, we're going to talk about money today. And I've always been, I think money is one of the greatest inventions of all times.
Yeah,
I love money, and I like penetration as well.
Dawie, so it sounds to me like you've been inside the belly of the beast, both in the Reserve Bank and then looking at how private entities kind of respond to what the Reserve Bank does from the investment side. I mean, this kind of Reserve Bank drives everything, and so it's very easy for people to look at, let's say, an institution like the Reserve Bank and the Rand and think that because it's been around our entire lives and for last close to 100 years. Well, I think the Reserve Bank just turned 100 recently, didn't they?
The end of this year, actually. Yes.
Okay, end of this year. So people tend to think that fiat money or government money that's always been the case. But has money always been controlled by the state?
No, maybe it's a good. Maybe I can give you a short background, or at least the way I understand it, and where we come from, or why we are what we are today. We've never had it so good. Let me give you one number. 100 years ago, more than 90% of people on this planet lived in abject poverty. Abject poverty means that you go to bed hungry. Today it's less than 10%. Within the next decade, within the next 10 years or so, we won't have hunger anymore. We won the fight against real poverty. So that's just one number. But to get to where we are today, it took a very long time. It took us many, many thousands of years. And I would like to just start the whole story. We can go back even further if you want to. But a good place to start is approximately 15,000 years ago. And that was a good place to start because that's the first time that we started domesticating animals. Now that, as far as I'm concerned, was a major breakthrough because the concept of ownership was only established when we started to really establish and protect it about 15,000 years ago. The process of the protection of private property rights and the concept of private property was only established then. And that was important, very, very important, because that unleashed so much energy that eventually led to where we are today. Now, remember, the reason why I say that is there's a saying in economics that goes that there is no free lunch, basically meaning that there is nothing for free, everything costs money or costs something somewhere. But there is one free lunch, and that free lunch is the exchange of property. We call it trade today. If there's a buyer and a seller of something, then both the buyer and the seller gain, and they both gain because otherwise the transaction would not have happened. And in order for people to be allowed to trade, the concept of private property must be very well established. And that's why that's why I started about 15,000 years ago with it. And after that, there were many other breakthroughs. So trade is only possible with private property, and trade initially started off as normal barter trade. So I will exchange my cow for, say, 10 sheep, and 1 sheep for 10 chickens, for instance, if I want the chicken. So clearly you can see there's a problem with trade with barter trade, because if I want the chicken, I have a cow, then I have an issue. I've got a problem. I cannot benefit to the same extent because of the energy of trade, because there's a problem exchanging my cow for a chicken. And that's why that led to the next major economic breakthrough, and that's the invention of money. And that started probably also around about 7,000-8,000 years ago, when we started domesticating plants, making it easier for people to trade, and we started using all sorts of things for money. So initially there were various forms of money, and it's important to understand that, and we're going to get to this a little bit later, that the definition for money is anything that is generally accepted as money is money. And it's important to understand that because we're going to talk a little bit later about things like Bitcoin and so on. So that's the definition of money. And various things got accepted generally as money, things like shells, things like cattle, for instance, or eventually we settled on metal. Until about, not that long ago, gold was generally accepted as international money. But there were various forms of money in the past, like, for example, silver and gold and all sorts of other things. And today we talk about electronic money or even digital so-called money. It's also important to understand that money evolved as economies become more sophisticated. So initially we had no money, we exchanged stuff, but before we could do that, we had to establish. And that's why I believe in the free market system, because at the core of the free market system is ownership. So you have to have the protection of private property, ownership. It's crucially important. And then from there on, we can exchange ownership between you and me, but we need something to facilitate that. And money was obviously a thing that we needed to facilitate trade between you and me. And gradually money evolved, and today we have electronic money. But the question is, and something, and I don't have an answer to that, as money evolved, did that lead to more economic activity, or was more economic activity actually pushing the evolution of money? What's the causality here? And I don't really know what it is, but it's very clear. If you go through the history of economics, you will see every time we move to a higher level of economic activity, it also coincided with some sort of change in the way that we use money. And today money, so we had money, physical money, and then we eventually settled on gold. Then we had derivatives of money, like, for example, notes and coins were actually derivatives of gold money. and then we settled on electronic money, and the bulk of money today is actually in electronic form. And electronic money is actually a derivative of note money, which is a derivative of gold money. So it's a derivative of a derivative in a way. And then we stepped off the gold standard in 1971. And then from then on, we mostly had so-called fiat money. And the word fiat means, it's a Latin word that means let there be. And that's exactly what it is. Let there be money, and there is money. And central banks today are hugely powerful institutions, and they can literally make money out of nothing. And they do that all the time. And the most recent evolution in money is, again, moving back to private monies. And we call it things like so-called crypto money. I don't like the word. I prefer to call it private monies. But in the history of mankind, money usually was managed by the private sector. It was issued by private banks or private institutions or by goldsmiths in the past. So it had various forms of money. And maybe before we get to the next point, but maybe I can just make this comment, is that in the history of money, politicians and kings and queens and tsars and sultans, all those, they always wanted to take control of money. And they've always, in the history of money, they've always destroyed money. There's no single currency that has survived a government or politicians. They've always destroyed money, and they've used all various means to destroy money by mixing some gold, some lead into the gold, for instance, forcing people to use money that with only the head of the king on, for instance, and money always disappeared. And quite often in the history of mankind, you will find that there was a government money which was replaced by private money, and then politicians tried to monopolize it again. And also in the case of South Africa. In the case of South Africa, the South African currency, the rand, became legal tender in 1961. So that is 60 years old this year, the South African currency. And during that time, the South African rand has lost nearly 99% of its value. So, and the same goes for the American dollar. They've also, I don't have the exact number, they've lost something like 30-40% of the US currency. The dollar has lost about 30-40% of its value over the past 60 years or so. So, fiat money always loses its value, and fiat money is still today monopolized by central banks, and central banks are hugely powerful institutions, and it's central banks that decide what is the price of money, interest rates. And they are also responsible for all sorts of things today, for economic activity, for the labor market even, for economic growth, all that. So yeah, there's a very long answer to a very short question.
I mean, it's fascinating, but the thing that always surprises me is that fiat currencies have got 100% failure rates, and yet the Reserve Bank and all these institutions walk around as if they've done us a service. You know, they're always blowing their own horn and look at what a good job we've done, but their track record is horrific. I mean, it always leads to the absolute destruction. And then what happens to the capital that gets destroyed? So not the actual money, but the capital, the productive capital that people have produced over time that just gets destroyed by the debasement of their currency. It sets humanity back, you know, every time it happens. Yeah, I mean, it's I would argue one of the biggest scams of our time. But people always work out a way to route around these systems, and they come up with their own private monies. But that doesn't mean that private monies are without their own drawbacks. I mean, we've got many examples of private monies failing as well, right? You know, if we take like the rice stones of Yap, which are those massive stones that they had in Polynesia, that they'd go and mine on another island and ship them across and stand in the middle of the town as a form of money. It's very hard to reproduce, but ultimately it was driven out by hard money when British traders arrived in South Pacific with gold. And so there's always like a creative destruction of private monies. But the key difference with private monies, I suppose, is that even if they do fail, they get replaced by a better, harder money, as opposed to a government money that just tries to stop all other forms of money under their jurisdiction. But why is that? Why do governments always try to centralize money under fiat?
Well, the answer to that is very, very easy to understand, and that is there's a lot of money to be made out of making money, and central banks make a lot of money, and they make it out of nothing, and it's a very, very, very profitable business to be the central bank. I think the major issue here, and let's not be too hard on governments or on central banks. I would argue that, and I guess if we haven't had central banks, I think the private sector would have come to the party in any event, and we would have had private money in any event, and
Yeah.
maybe we could have been even more successful than what we are. But central banks haven't always been doing a horrible job. I think they've missed a couple of things a number of times. I think, for instance, one of the major uh, financial crises that we've experienced 10 years ago was caused by the wrong by the wrong monetary policy by central banks. They made money too cheap. And talk about the price of money, interest rates, that is just another price in the economy. And central banks, because they monopolize this product called money, they decide what is the price of money. They decide what interest rates are. And I can tell you, I've studied communism, and that's the biggest flaw in communism, is that they do not, one of the biggest flaws, and that is that they do not allow the prices to be determined by supply and demand forces in the economy. It's not only the price of money, it's the price of bread or beer or whatever. The moment you start fixing prices, you distort the allocation of resources in your economy. And it doesn't matter if it's the price of beer or the price of money. And that's what central banks do. They decide in their wisdom that the price of money should be X, and they fix it there, leading to all sort of distortions in the economy. And what we are currently seeing is another example of a distortion. The financial markets are running red hot at the moment. The financial markets are doing very, very well at the moment. And part of the reason for that is simply because central banks have decided in their wisdom to reduce interest rates to very low levels, even below zero. They've decided to create money, huge amounts of money, call it quantitative easing out of nothing. And all that money is looking for a place to go to. And they go to the financial markets. You get this financial markets are just going up. Equity prices are going up. Bond prices are going up. And that leads to all sort of distortions at various levels. So people that participate in the financial markets, they've got a very good time at the moment, and they're usually well-off individuals, while people, and of course companies, while people that do not participate in the financial markets, quite often poorer people, they do not get the full benefit of this. The real economy, in other words, do not necessarily get the benefit of this very loose monetary policy that central banks are following internationally. And that leads to this huge gap between the haves and have-nots. We call it inequality. So central banks and governments are talking about inequality. We have to reduce inequality, blah, blah, blah. But they are the main reason behind this huge increase in inequality. If we haven't had central banks and the private sector was issuing money, would it have been different? I just don't know. But what I do think what would have happened, and I think this is going to be the future of money in any event, is that the private sector, there would have been more competition. The private sector will not intentionally debase their currency. And that's what central banks are doing. Central banks want their currencies to fall in value. They have inflation targets. They tell us they want their money to fall in value. The central bank and the United States, the Federal Reserve, they tell us they want the dollar to fall by 2% or more. They tell us that. In the case of South Africa, the South African Central Bank tells us we want the rand to lose, say, 4.5% of its value every year. So central banks tell us they want their currency to lose its value. In the case of private sector money, there will be competition, and the private sector people will simply ditch the bad private sector monies and go after the better managed private sector monies. And the market will simply make sure that those monies that maintain its value will survive, while the other monies will simply disappear. And that's the way we've seen it for millennia. We've seen badly managed monies will simply disappear, and better managed monies will survive. And in a competitive environment, the good money will survive and the bad monies will disappear. And so I think the biggest problem that we have today is that in many countries, and that's changing, but in many countries, it's their national currency has a monopoly right. And I think that is going to disappear. And we've already seen many countries adopting even Bitcoin as a legal tender. In the case of South Africa, the only legal tender is still the South African currency, the rand. And in the case of the United States, of course, it is the US dollar. And in the case of the world, in a way, the US dollar is still the world's currency, in a way. There are various reasons for that. And it's likely to stay for that for some time. But I've got a suspicion technological changes are going to change that. And I've got a suspicion in future we're going to get far more competition between monies, and it's the better managed monies that will eventually survive. And I think it's going to be private monies and not fiat money or government-backed monies anymore.
So Dawie, sorry, Ricky. So you were explaining the Cantillon effect quite well there. And as central banks have pretty much reached 0% interest rates in most developed countries, they can't use that.
I think we've lost Brandon there. Just to carry on with Brandon's point. Oh, sorry, Brandon, you're back.
Guys.
Yeah.
Sorry, I lost you. I was just asking, as your interest rates have effectively gone to 0% in developed countries worldwide, and they don't have that, central banks don't have interest rates as a tool anymore. They're just going to print relentlessly. But what do you think? It's a bit of a big question, but as they print relentlessly now, which is their only tool left, and there will be a point of critical mass, what will they do after that? Do you reckon, to trying to keep their system in place? Do you have any ideas?
Yeah, I have, and I've got two opposing answers to that. But maybe I can just make a comment about the yield curve, about interest rates. People think interest rates is just something that the central bank decides upon. The repo rate is X, and therefore the prime rate is X plus 3.5% in South Africa. But interest rates are much more than that. It's not only short-term interest rates; there are medium-term interest rates and longer-term interest rates as well. And that is crucially important where those various interest rates in the economy, where they are, because, and I'm not going to get too technical, but basically what it comes down to, you can simply look at the interest rates in an economy, and that tells you just about everything about what the market thinks, what the future of this economy is going to be like. For instance, if longer-term interest rates are higher than shorter-term interest rates, it tells us that the market is expecting future economic growth. If long-term interest rates are lower, or the same as or lower than short-term interest rates, it means that the market is expecting a recession or contraction in your economy. So what happens now is that central banks, they set short-term interest rates. We call it in South Africa, we call it the repo rate. So they set short-term interest rates internationally at very low levels, even below zero, while long-term interest rates were left to the market and market supply and demand forces. But recently, central banks started interfering in that market as well. They started printing money out of nothing, forcing longer-term interest rates lower as well, and sometimes even below zero. Now, that leads to all sort of distortions on the economy, but it takes away a very important and a crucial signal, and that is this economy going to grow or not? Because we don't know, because central banks, they distort all these interest rates right across the so-called yield curve. Now, coming back to your question, so where is this whole party going to end? Because they've reduced interest rates to very low levels. They're distorting longer-term interest rates to absurd levels below zero. Below zero means that if you want to lend money to the German government, you have to pay them before they take your money. That's what it means. But it also raises the question, so how is this thing going to end? And I think there are two answers to that. One is, and this is the thinking of the financial markets at the moment. I'm not so sure about that, but this is the thinking of the financial markets at the moment. And that is that all this money creation, maybe we can talk about the velocity of money as well a little bit later, but all this money is going into the financial markets, and it's like anything else. If you create too much of something, the price of that will start falling. In the case of money, we call that inflation. So that is one possibility, that we're going to see very high levels of inflation eventually, which will, because inflation destroys money. So that's one possibility, and that's exactly what central banks want to do. They want to create the inflation and then try to contain it once it's taken hold. So that is what the financial markets are thinking at the moment, is that we're going to see inflation in future, and then depending how high inflation is going to go, will lead to things like the possibility of a huge increase in the price of gold, and maybe even the huge increase in the price of private monies like Bitcoin and so on. So that's one possible scenario. Another possible scenario is a Japanese scenario, where they've created all this extra liquidity. The money goes into the financial markets, and you get prices going up, and you get an initial spike in the inflation. And then people sort of lose interest, and demand in the economy cools down for various reasons. and prices start coming down again, and we go into a deflationary environment, and that is where the Japanese have been for the past 3 years. So that's a second possibility, is that we're not necessarily going to see inflation going forward, or much inflation going forward. We're going to see deflation, in fact, leaving central banks basically powerless to inflate the economies, because money is already, interest rates are down to zero already, and you get a situation where central banks are basically become your capital market, the way exactly where we are in Japan, leading to a very weak economic performance for many decades to come. So those are the two possible scenarios. I'm in two minds. I'm not sure which one of the two is going to happen. I do believe that we are at least going to see some short-term inflation, but the longer-term thing, I think there's a good possibility of the world economy falling back into a Japanese kind of scenario. So that's one answer. But before I get to your next question, let me just add something else. There's maybe a bit of a wild card that we are not aware, that we can't measure. And this wild card is, let's call it the gig economy, or the tech economy. Well, let me give you one number. I read a study in the United States, is that the act of Googling, if you take your phone and you Google, that the act of Googling is worth approximately $600 per individual annually in the US. So there's value. The act of Googling, this is only one example. The act of Googling is worth $600 for every individual in the United States. That value, namely Googling, is not included in any economic activity. So it is not captured in economic data anywhere. And I think the point I want to make, maybe because of technological advances, maybe the underlying economy and underlying economic growth, globally and locally, is in fact much stronger than what we think. And maybe economies are much bigger than what we think because of recent technological changes. If that is the case, then this deflation environment makes sense, because then we don't have enough money in the world. Then central banks did not create enough money in the world. So there are so many uncertainties out there that I really don't know what the answer to that is. But based on historic trends, I have very, very little doubt that currencies like the rand is going to disappear. It's already disappeared basically because it's lost just about all its value already. And small other currencies are also going to disappear. The only currencies that are likely to survive are the big ones, like the dollar or the renminbi, or something resembling that. Because the reason why I say that is because they've recently launched a digital central bank currency for the Chinese, and the other one's going to follow. Even South Africa is looking at that. So the smaller currencies are going to disappear because of technological changes. And I also have a suspicion that private monies, many of these private monies, are going to take over from the rand, for various reasons. Not only because they are monies, but for other technological reasons as well, because they make payments so much easier. So yes, so what the future holds, I don't know, but I'm very, very excited. And I can tell you one thing, based on what we've done the last couple of thousands of years, I am pretty sure the future is going to be much better than what we have today.
Yeah. So Dawie, on the private money side, is it then, well, there's a historical precedent for it, and do you think it's going to be the case where in this transition period we see private monies and government monies functioning in parallel with each other, even if the government outlaws them?
Yeah. And you can't outlaw it because it's information. And that's the way that they have to think about money. I mean, the definition, like I said earlier, of money is anything that's generally accepted as money. And today, money, many different forms of money are generally accepted as money. Bitcoin, as an example, recently, we know about how Bitcoin increased in price. And I think part of the reason is because it became more generally accepted as money. But I think we also have to look at money slightly different. I said it is basically information today, and if information can change. Let me give you one example of money, of how information can change. Say, for instance, I have a call option on your car. I can buy your car for 100 Rand in a year's time. In the meantime, car prices goes up, so I can use this call option and I can convert it and sell it to somebody else and convert that into money. So this call option is money in a way. It's become information. And that's very important because of smart contracts that we can put on the various platforms and things like that. So I think we all know that money's got various functions. And I think in future you will get private monies that can fulfill all these functions, but some private monies will specialize or will be used for certain functions, while other private monies will be used for other functions. Let me give you one example. In the case of Bitcoin, Bitcoin is to transact in Bitcoin is not very practical. It takes, if you compare that to how many transactions MasterCard or Visa card can do in a second, and you compare that to Bitcoin, it's very clear that Bitcoin is not going to rival MasterCard or Visa soon because it's just too expensive and it takes too long to buy a bread with Bitcoin. But you can use your Bitcoin to save it, to put your assets in, to put it away for future consumption. So you can use it as a store of value. And there are other monies, private monies, that are much cheaper to do transactions with than Bitcoin. So I foresee a future where certain kinds of money, like Bitcoin, for example, will be seen as a store of value. And if you want to go and buy your groceries, you take a small piece of your Bitcoin, you convert it into another kind of private money, or maybe even in a more liquid or in a cheaper version of Bitcoin, and you use that to buy your bread and your beer and whatever the case, for transaction money. And I think that's what the future is going to look like, is that you will have various monies competing at various levels for various functions, and people will move from one kind of money to the other one. Maybe we can still call it all money X, which can act as a store of value, but it can also act as a transaction kind of money, but actually we will be using it on various different platforms, for instance. So I think that's what the future of money is going to look like. I also believe that the government money will be around for quite some time. And like I've said earlier, the dollar is likely to remain the dominant currency for a long time. And let me just give you a reason for that. One is that we use the dollar for international trade mostly. We use the dollar because the American economy is still, on a nominal value, the biggest economy in the world. But we also use the US dollar because once you've got US dollars, you can do something with it. The South African Central Bank, for example, if we export more than what we import, which is the case in South Africa currently, then the South African Reserve Bank will end up with a lot of dollars, and they don't take these dollars and put it somewhere under the Sechekanyahu's bed. They take the dollars and they reinvest it back in the US economy, typically in the US capital market, which is very, very deep and which is very, very liquid. You can't take renminbi, the Chinese currency, and invest it in the Chinese capital market because they've got a very much a regulated capital market, which certainly hasn't got the liquidity that the American capital market. And for that simple reason, the US dollar is likely to remain a dominant currency for a very long time to come. But it doesn't mean that there's not space for private currencies. I think private currencies will simply become more and more important over time. And will eventually start rivaling the big currencies like the US dollar and the renminbi, the euro, and so on, eventually as well.
Dawie, I want to tie in those 2 points you just raised there about the size of the US dollar and something like Bitcoin. So the reason why, my perspective, why the US dollar is so useful is because it's got this massive network effect, right? They've got layers built on top of the US dollar, which is, let's say, the protocol underlying layer is US dollar. And the utility, like the capital markets, are smart contracts effectively that are built in layers on top of it. And that's what gives it the depth and the network effects, obviously, the protocol. So in terms of private monies, it's the same thing. Like you're going for a network effect. So if someone is using, let's say, the Ura, for example, that they tried in Oranje, that's a private money with an extremely small network effect that just applies in Oranje, for example. Whereas something like Bitcoin is a global money, right? It's I wouldn't say it's accepted everywhere, but it's known everywhere, and it's accessible everywhere. And then if Bitcoin is now competing with other private monies like, let's say, Ethereum and Cardano and Litecoin and all of these, what it comes down to is the network effect. And what gives money a network effect ultimately is its ability to not be debased and not be screwed with. And that's where Bitcoin wins out. So in our opinion, what you were saying earlier about the transaction layer versus the settlement layer. So in other words, Bitcoin competing with MasterCard and Visa, it's not really competing at that level. Bitcoin is competing one protocol level down, which is at the USD level. So with central banks as a settlement layer, because to send money, it takes 10 minutes to settle with finality at a cost of, a couple of Satoshis. Let's say it costs you $5 to send $20 million of value in 10 minutes. That's cheaper and faster than any settlement layer that exists currently between central banks, for example. But then the layer that needs to be built on top of that in order for it to scale, something like Lightning, which competes with Visa and MasterCard, which allows instant and basically, let's call it free, but they're not really free, but extremely cheap transactions. That layer can scale. And then you can build a layer on top of Lightning, for example, which is your smart contract layer where you can do your financial products. And there was a big, I wouldn't say a product launch, but they kind of had like a stealth launch yesterday where guys are starting to build smart contract layers and capital markets on top of Lightning and on top of Bitcoin in layer 3, which means you can earn interest. So for countries like El Salvador that might be accumulating, which are going to be accumulating Bitcoin, now have an option to earn yield on their Bitcoin. So instead of having to convert it to US treasuries to battle inflation, which is why nation states invest in US treasuries, so they don't sit on the dollar and have it debased by inflation. You can now, your Bitcoin, you don't really have to invest because it's deflationary and the growth in purchasing power increases over time. But you can also earn a yield on it, which exponentially increases your purchasing power. So it's very interesting to see how these things are developing, but it's open source. It's going to take some time. It's a very slow process with Bitcoin. The Lightning and the layer 3s are built much faster because they can be more reckless. But the protocol layer underlying is what you need to really keep stable and make sure that everything is done correctly.
Yeah, so just a caveat on that, that's what Bitcoin is, right? It's just a settlement layer, and that's what they built for 10 years. And they did it prudently in an open source manner, and they did it carefully. And now they've just done a release called Taproot. Don't need to dive into that, but basically it's a lot less data intensive, and now you can put a lot more data into blocks, which means you can start building smart contracts down on the first chain, moving towards the second chain. And that means you can do a lot more transactions per second, but it also means you can look at products like Dawie, right? So the stable currencies on Bitcoin now, you can do that on the second layer. So that's what I'm excited about. And I would just say that like Ethereum people and all that, be very scared.
I mean, it is absolutely, go for it, Dawie.
Let me. Obviously, you guys are from a technical point of view, you've got much better insights into this whole thing than what I have. But can I just try to link this up with what you just said to something else that I've picked up in the economy? And I did mention earlier about the value of Googling. So I think there's far more economic activity going on that we are aware of. But even the things that we are aware of are that, for instance, that economies are moving into the tertiary industries. Economies are becoming more service-oriented, and services are usually more digitizable. That fits in with the evolution of money as well. The economies today, and let me give you one example. People tend to think that the dirty industries, like for example, agriculture, for instance, is part of the primary industries. That is not the case. You'll see where it leads to now. And that's not the case. Agriculture is an excellent example of an industry that is actually, to a large extent, represented in the tertiary sector today and not in the primary sector. And the reason why that is because the actual value add in agriculture today is in the form of drones, is in the form of genetic engineering, is in the form of precision farming. It's a technologically driven thing, agriculture. And many of these activities are actually created in the tertiary industries. Coming back to your network thing. So my suspicion is that when we think about economies, we think of a geographic area called South Africa, and there are certain economic activities happening there. That's an outdated way of thinking of an economy, because that's not where economies function today. Economies function today on networks. Facebook is a network in a way. And imagine if this network, maybe you and I don't even know where you guys are at the moment. but we're talking to one another with this amazing technology. We are exchanging views. We are creating value here, hopefully. It's worth something, but it's not captured anymore. And we can actually create some value out of this, and we can actually sell this, and we can decide amongst one another that we're going to use for our own currency. We create our own coin, and we're going to use this on our network. The point I'm trying to make is that the economies in future, we have to move away from this concept of a geographic area, and we have to think more of a network concept. And it's the service industry, it's the tech industry, and that includes money, where we can decide what kind of money we want to use and on what kind of platform and what kind of contracts we want to use. And the implications for this has got some serious political implications, because suddenly we use our own kind of money, which means because the stuff is encrypted and because we're not anywhere, we're everywhere. That also means there are questions about taxes. Will politicians be able to take the same sort of taxes that they've been accustomed to? And I think no. And the outcome of all of this may eventually lead to the disintegration of political structures. And I think South Africa is an ideal candidate for that, because we have a corrupt, incompetent government, and people don't want to pay tax to this. And they can get away from it because they simply join another network. We all join the Flat Earth Society if we want to, and we issue a Flat Earth coin, and we do business somewhere in the cloud and nobody knows about it, and we all live happily ever after. So yes, I agree with you. I think this new technology will eventually lead to even political changes. And the outcome of all of this is that the power will go back to where it's supposed to be, and it's in my hands, and I can do business whoever I want to, and I won't have to be, I won't be parasitized the same way that I am currently being parasitized by the current political elite. It fits in with your network idea.
Absolutely. I mean, this is the kind of central thesis for the sovereign individual, right? The book that was written in 1997, where the rise of microprocessing brings power back to the individual because the cost of doing violence by the state just outweighs the gains they make. And if us as individuals, as sovereign individuals, decide that we want to transact, okay, let's say we use our own coin from this chat, the network effect is 3 users. But if we tap into a network that has millions of users, hundreds of millions of users around the world, that now nation states have started adopting something that is Bitcoin, the purchasing power and the value you get from that network effect is exponential, as opposed to having a smaller network. And this is why we believe...
we remain physical beings. I mean, you still have some... I mean, in the case of South Africa, the biggest danger is being attacked in your house kind of thing. And that's why people are living in estates, looking after you. We've privatized the police force in South Africa. That's why I say South Africa is such an ideal place, because we've privatized the whole place. We've privatized the police force. I have privatized electricity because I've got my own electricity, my own free sun out there. I've got my own boreholes. I've got my own security system. My kids are at home at the moment. I'm a grade 2 teacher, and I can do that. I can do that because of the technology. All of those are examples where we don't need politicians anymore. We can look after ourselves, and we can join whatever network we want to and add value to that network.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, but now the question is, the state's not going to take this line down because this is a direct attack on their power, essentially. It takes away their power. So then the question becomes one of if you're going to build a private money, it needs to be robust enough to withstand a state level attack. And if your money cannot withstand a state level attack, then there's a waste of time to even try to start with. And if we look at something like gold, for example, gold, in my opinion, has been co-opted because there's the centralization of gold until it finally just gets centralized into the vaults of central banks. And then they play their shenanigans in the futures market by issuing a huge amount of paper contracts. That is far more than the gold that's actually in the vault. And now you end up with a suppressed gold price. And this has been, I mean, people, it sounds tinfoil hat, but Deutsche Bank has pleaded guilty to this. There's been many court cases where the banks have been fined for doing exactly this. But so if you're going to start a private money, it needs to be censorship resistant and it needs to be decentralized by nature. And to get to your point about South Africa you made, I think we are perfectly positioned globally, right up there with number one in the world position to have this renaissance. Because the people are there in their minds already. We've already got our own police force, with private security being the biggest per capita in the world. Very quickly going to have our own education, because the education system in South Africa is essentially collapsing. Electricity, you're going to have to make a plan yourself. But look at electricity as a prime example of the government not wanting to give up the ability to maintain that monopoly, even though it cannot provide, but it can still maintain the monopoly because it has the centralization of the power grid. So with that in mind, like how, just that scenario, how do you see this playing out in South Africa?
Yeah, just a comment about gold. There are many instances where gold is actually put in vaults, but not in central bank vaults, but in private sector vaults, and you can actually get derivatives on gold. You can have a digital currency with a so-called stable coin, as you guys know better than me, with the gold. Gold can be used as money as well, and there are more. In fact, I've got some gold and digital money based on gold. But your question about, I did say,
the Troy Gold guys in Stellenbosch are doing exactly that, right?
Yeah, and I've got my Troy Gold card here somewhere. So yes, exactly that. So I think that's an exciting sort of move in that direction as well. But coming back, how will politicians stop this? Well, you guys are a little bit younger than me, and I don't know, you guys won't know this, but there was a couple of years ago, many years ago, in South Africa, a magazine called The Scope. Now, The Scope was the closest we could get to the Playboy, because the Playboy was illegal in South Africa. And whenever somebody gets the opportunity to go overseas, I mean, that was one of the first things that we would try to smuggle in, is to get in a couple of Playboys into South Africa, because it was illegal in South Africa. Pornography was illegal in South Africa. Now, that's changed subsequently, except that the legislation changed or laws changed, but it became basically impossible to stop pornography, because pornography today has become information. You can send it anywhere in the world, because it is zeros and ones. And that's why I said earlier that money is not, money today is information. It is nothing else but information. And the only way that you can stop information is to shut down all forms of electronic communication between individuals. That's the only way that you can stop information. And money today pretty much is like pornography. You cannot stop it. You cannot stop it. And that's why I don't think, of course, politicians will try to stop it. Look, for example, in China. In China, Bitcoin is officially illegal, but some of the biggest Bitcoin mines in the world are in China. Because electricity is so cheap. So the answer to that is no, you cannot stop that, because you cannot stop information. It will go on. So I'm afraid no, politicians they've got some there's a big storm about to hit them, and I don't think many of them are aware of the future of money and how we can simply get around them, because money has become information. And I think that's why. Yeah, that's why I'm not concerned about it. Yeah.
Our politicians especially will have no idea what's going to hit them.
No, I haven't got a clue what's happening. I know, me personally, Bitcoin is also banned in China, in Russia, by the way. And I've seen Bitcoin to people in Russia, and they've sent it back to me plenty of times, and there's no way they can stop it, because it's information. And you know, that's a wonderful thing about the modern private money, digital modern private. I don't like the word virtual, by the way, but digital modern money. Is that they ban it in Russia and think that you can ban it in a geographic area. It's not geographic. It's not anywhere. It's everywhere. And the same in the case of South Africa. The moment you buy Bitcoin in South Africa, we have foreign exchange regulations in South Africa telling you that you're only allowed to invest X amount of money abroad. Can you believe that? I mean, I make my own money. I pay my taxes on that, and then I have to ask a politician if I'm allowed to take my money out of the country. But the moment I buy Bitcoin or any one of these other private currencies, that moment my money becomes international, and foreign exchange regulations become totally and completely irrelevant. So no, but this idea of a geographic area is completely out of date, and politicians don't understand that yet.
You know, the one of the ways they control the flow of information is obviously by buying off the newspapers, as we've seen in the Zondo Commission, and purchasing a narrative and attacking it through like a FUD attack, like a fear, uncertainty, a doubt attack, where they just trash talk Bitcoin. But one of the other ways they do, which is much more insidious in China, where they regulate the internet, they create a firewall. But now
Yes.
what's happening on Bitcoin, which is extremely exciting, is one of the third layers being built on top of Lightning is decentralized VPN, so decentralized virtual private networks, and completely ethereal encrypted direct communication channels. So if you're on the Lightning network, which no one can stop because it's on the Bitcoin network and the most robust network on earth, I can communicate to you directly in North Korea, send you encrypted messages, which are unsearchable. They disappear as soon as we finished with them.
Yeah.
And it can't be taken down because it's leveraging the security of the Bitcoin networks. In other words, for North Korea to be able to stop that, they would have to do a 51% attack on Bitcoin, which would bankrupt them and take all of their electricity. So the strength of the decentralized network is growing, and these things are exponential, right? Because it's open source. So there's so many people around the world working on it, and I don't think ever before in human history, possibly, we have never had so many people hate governments as much as we have today.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And obviously, like I've said, that you guys are technologically much stronger than me. So I'm looking at things a little bit different than you. I'm looking at it from an economic point of view. But me, I'm not technologically very strong, and I can tell you that I have been in Russia myself, and I've made use of a VPN to watch certain television stations in the UK. I've got friends in China. And it's very very regulated in China. I've got friends in China that talk to me on VPNs, help me with all sort of other stuff as well. And that's in a very very regulated environment, like for example in China. And even me, with my weak technological background, can actually make use of this amazing technology. So yes, it's become totally impossible for politicians to control us the way that they would like to, and to control us the way that they used to control us. Remember the world in the past, I mean, there were cases, and it's not too long ago, even today, where you were prepared to give up your life for your king. You are prepared to fight for somebody else, for somebody else's castle. I'm not prepared to do that. I've got my own castle here.
Not fighting for Nkandla.
No, certainly not. Not anymore. I've got too much power on my hands today. And it's not only a matter of technology. I also believe, and this is actually far more important, there is a mind shift taking place internationally as well. And the mind shift is for people to understand that, listen, I'm the most important person in this world, and I want to be treated like the most important person in this world. Obviously, I don't mean it in a literal sense, but what I mean by that is that we are all important individuals, and there's no pecking order that the politicians should be. There should be a president. Who's he? Who is this guy thinking he can push me off the road because he's got a big black car with blue lights? I'm far more important. He works for me. Let's get the pecking order straight here.
Yes, amen.
So Dawie, I don't know if you've seen the position paper by the IFWG on crypto assets that came out last week.
The one that they want to classify it as officially as financial instruments.
Yes, that one. So we're pretty excited about that because, first of all, financial advisors can start helping people buy Bitcoin, which I think a lot of people struggle with. And I really think like that's important because there's so many scams out there, and to help people buy and self-custody it in their own wallet setup, and also be able to pass beneficiaries is going to be so important. But I looked at all the other things, and basically they're ring fencing exchanges to report on everything, and there's a whole lot of other pretty bureaucratic, archaic proposals there, and I feel like that's where they're going to hinder through regulation and hinder the innovation there. But then you look at El Salvador and the way that they grew a community through Bitcoin that eventually became taken by the government is that people pay Bitcoin to a vendor, and a vendor accepts Bitcoin, and then that vendor uses Bitcoin to pay for something else, right? It's a closed system. But as soon as you try to change that to rands or dollars, in and out, cash in, cash out, that's where all the regulation and shit happens.
Exactly.
Where the surveillance happens.
Yeah, so we need to think of a way in South Africa of how people will accept Bitcoin, how people when they pay for it, and keep the Bitcoin.
It's going to be a gradual process. It's going to be a gradual process, but we are involved in something as well. You mentioned the URA earlier. We digitized the URA in an experiment some time ago, and it worked quite well. And if I'm not mistaken, they're doing it at the moment. There is a digital URA available. But we are, in my company, what we are doing, we are asset managers. We look after people's money, and we have listed financial instruments on the JSE. So it's a normal financial instrument. We call it a note on the JSE. And what we are planning to do soon is that we are going to issue a so-called stable coin against this financial instrument on the JSE. So you give me 100 Rand, I'll take your 100 Rand and I'll give you a coin, and I'll take the 100 Rand and I'll buy something on the JSE. But now we are on a on a network, and you can sell the coin on the network, and you can eventually exchange this coin for Bitcoin or whatever you want to. And I think that's how the thing is going to evolve. It's going to be a gradual process where we make use of existing structures, and then sort of add on private structures to that, and eventually we will move away from the existing structures. In this example, what is likely to happen, the JSE, because everybody understands the JSE, that's where you list South African breweries, or where you list all these Sasol, for instance, or whatever. But you can issue a derivative on that, basically a coin on that, and then the JSE becomes basically a warehouse, nothing else. And the JSE in the process is going to disappear, because suddenly nobody's trading on the JSE anymore, they're trading on a derivative. And there are many other examples in the world of exactly this already happening. So I think that's how the thing is going to evolve. We make use of existing structures and just simply add on until you don't need existing structures anymore. We simply move into this new wonderful private world where individuals matter and not politicians.
Amen. Dawie, one last question before we wrap up here. I know that you are quite keen on and involved with the self-determination in South Africa, as are we. And how do you see this kind of playing out with individual cultural groups who are looking for self-determination to opt out of the RAN, for example, especially groups that are suffering persecution, or are more persecuted than others?
Let me try to give you a bit of an economic, political answer to that. I see things panning out in South Africa. Now, I did say at the beginning of our talk that my expertise is on the fiscal accounts. That means taxes and all that. And I've been following that for many, many years. And I can tell you, in the case of South Africa, the fiscal accounts, the state, the glue that keep the whole thing politically together in South Africa is the taxpayer. So that because the taxpayer, we've got a I'm not going to go into all the detail, you know that, but we have a relatively few people pay just about all the taxes in the country, and those taxes, a large chunk of that is simply getting stolen, but those taxes are primarily used to spend on poor people, which it's not necessarily a bad thing, but there's a lot of issues there. People don't have the choice on various things, and you're simply forced to pay so much taxes, and politicians misallocate all the taxes and all that. But the point I want to make is that the fiscal accounts in South Africa have become completely unstable. The debt levels of the state has reached levels that it's become dangerously high. And because we're not the dollar, we're in South Africa. We've got the South African currency. And I have a suspicion that this thing will gradually start it's already starting to fall over. The NEL has fallen over. South African Airways has fallen over. Eskom is in the process of falling over. The list goes on and on and on. And eventually the central government will become unstable as well. And that may lead to the central government in a way collapsing as well. And it has collapsed at various levels. I mean, if you talk about a government, the first thing you think of is an army and a police force. We don't have a police force anymore. We basically don't have an army anymore. It's been privatized to a large extent. And I think that is how we're going to see things panning out in South Africa. Is that you're going to see pretty much a collapse of the center, because the taxpayer simply is going to refuse supporting this whole thing. And South Africa can fall apart politically. There are already calls for the Western Cape to exit the Western Cape. The Western Cape guys. And there are, Goodwill Zwelithini, the king of the Zulus, before he died, even mentioned taking KZN out of the union, because basically we live in the union in a way. So that's how I think the thing is going to pan out. If you're not technologically advanced, what's going to happen to you, there will be warlords that will take over regions. Yeah. And we had that in South Africa as well. What do you think? What was Ace Magashule in the Free State? He was in a way a warlord. Or David Mabuza and Mpumalanga, he was in a way a warlord. And that's what happened in the rest of Africa. But large chunks of South Africa, areas, geographic areas, but also digital areas, will become self-sufficient to a large extent. Because they are technologically advanced, because they have an internet connection like what we have here, and because they belong to a network of some sort. And that's what I think is going to pan out. And then there are many dangers, of course, in this whole process. It's never nice for any political entity to start falling apart. We can see it all. Look at Sudan, look at Somalia, and those sort of places. But I think South Africa is different because of the human capital that we have here, and because of the technology that we have here, and because of the networks that we have here. So my advice to people is that make sure a couple of things. Stay safe, because you're a physical being. Make sure you know and understand what is going on. Make sure you've got you've got enough technological knowledge to participate in the new wonderful digital economy of the world, and make sure you have a good connection, good internet connection. And if you've got that, you can join any party or any group, any network that you would like to, and you can actually still have a wonderful, beautiful weather that we have in South Africa. We can still have our steaks and a brandy and cokes, and you can be wherever you want to, because you're part of a digital community that you choose who you want to join.
And the best pinotage on earth.
And you can have the best pinotage on earth.
Dawie, I think we're going to leave it there. Thank you so much for your time. That was a fantastic interview.
Thank you, Dawie.
And just before we go, where can people find your work? What's the best place for them to follow you?
You just Google my name and you will find, just Google my name. I guess that's the easiest. I write a lot of stuff. If you want to get my email address, just Google my name, you get my email address and send me just send me an email and put you on my distribution list. I write a lot of stuff. Usually it's boring stuff about interest rates and economic growth and so on, but sometimes I try my hand on something like, for example, private currencies as well.
Awesome. Once again, Dawie, thank you so much. Everyone, thanks for joining us. And I hope to see you soon.
My pleasure. Thank you. Wonderful talking to you guys.
Thanks Dawie. Cheers there.
Bye. Bye.